only a clicker for Ralph. Yeah. So then you go and sit back down afterwards. No. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps I could ask you to take your seats. We're about to start in a couple of minutes. There are a few people just coming through the doors, but as soon as they are in, we will begin. for what I hope will be a very exciting afternoon and a chance for us to review just where the bank has been operating over the past 25 years, what that region now looks like, what our new region has been through in the southern and eastern Mediterranean, and where we think things will go. And I'd advise you to turn off your mobile phones, by the way, this afternoon, so, as I forgot to do. So welcome to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and our event. It's our 25th anniversary discussion, the EBRD at 25, Investing for Change. And we'll also be hearing over the course of the next hour the latest from our Life in Transition survey. This study is one we do of about 50,000 households, right the way across the EBRD countries of operations, all the way as far east as you can go. It's the third time that we've done it. It's a very important survey which gives a flavor of how people in our region are really thinking about the transition that they've been through over the past 25 years. And what that tells us about political and economic change in the region. And we'll have a snapshot of the latest survey, the results of which are just starting to come in now, the raw data, and we'll be hearing from our Office of the Chief Economist about that. But first, some of you might be wondering, well, what's the EBRD been doing for the past 25 years? Let me give you a quick flavor of that now, because overall, well, what we've been doing is investing huge amounts of money across 3 continents in changing lives. Here's a quick video, so you can see for yourselves. So that's just a brief snapshot. Obviously, to tell the whole story would take rather longer than we have this afternoon. But let's hear a little bit more about the EBRD, past, present, future, our country's past, present, future. I'd like to ask the President of the EBRD, Suma Chakrabarti, to deliver a keynote address for us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you, friends, for coming to this very important and interesting event. Well, dear friends, I think I can say that in the great sweep of history, a quarter of a century can pass in the twinkling of an eye. But the same period can also bring momentous change across many, many continents, and so it has proved in our countries of operation. And such a period, in my view, is long enough to have seen the EBRD grow into the powerful force for good that it is today. Now, you all know the EBRD was born some 25 years ago this week, the child of an era of revolution and decisive change. And as we celebrate, we should really recall the story so far. We should assess the progress that we've made and also reflect on how the bank can do more in the future. You saw in that video the sudden breaching of the Berlin Wall. That led to the collapse, as we all know, of communism in many countries of the then Soviet bloc, and some 2 years later, the fall of the Soviet Union itself. Now, most of us who are alive at the end of 1989 will never forget the scenes of East Germans standing in triumph on top of the Berlin Wall. This was symbolic for many of us of the tearing up of the very Iron Curtain that divided Europe down its very heart. And within weeks, yes, within weeks, Western European leaders and others in the international community were responding to that new challenge. And one of the most pressing dilemmas that they faced was how to build a market economy out of the ruins of central planning. And of course, the Polish intellectual Adam Mickiewicz summed up eloquently the daunting challenge of post-socialist transition when he said in his very famous quote now, "We know very well how to make fish soup out of an aquarium, but we don't know how to make an aquarium out of fish soup." And I think when we've asked him what he meant by this, he meant that the job of helping to turn societies traumatized by years of totalitarianism into functional market economies fell in no small way to us here at the EBRD. The EBRD was established to build a new post-Cold War era in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. Our founding documents express that vision for me very, very clearly. The bank's purpose is to foster the transition towards open market-oriented economies and to promote private and entrepreneurial initiative in countries committed to and applying the principles of multi-party democracy, pluralism, and market economics. As such, our primary focus is working with the private sector. That was certainly no shortage of work to do on that score back in the early 1990s, and it's good to see people here from that era, like Ron and others, who really helped forge that vision at the time. Anyone who visited the region at that time, as I did, would have been confronted by a Rust Belt landscape of dilapidated or even abandoned factories. Even those that were still in business were in poor shape, uncompetitive, and handicapped by decades of underinvestment. But the EBRD soon swung into action, investing in its first project in the Bank of Poznan in Poland. Since then, the bank has invested more than 100 billion euros in thousands of projects, over 4,500 projects. Each of those euros unlocked an average of 2 more from other sources. But our mission has never been just about money. This bank has always believed very strongly in the demonstration effect, encouraging others to follow the example that we set. So over the past 25 years, many of the economies in which we've been active have undergone major, major changes. We've seen the role of the private sector enhanced, we've seen entrepreneurship encouraged, market competition boosted, and emerging market economies better integrated into global supply chains. All very good. But there remains so much more to do. It was fashionable, of course, immediately after 1989, to suggest that the shift from communism to a fully free market economy would be over within a decade. Now, we all know that turned out to be hopelessly optimistic. Such a shift actually is going to be the work of generations. And in a few minutes, Ralph de Haas will be unveiling insights into the latest survey of households and values in the countries where we invest. Now, we conduct this Life in Transition survey with the World Bank, and it consistently shows that change does not happen without pain. The previous survey revealed that only around 40% of respondents were reasonably satisfied with their lives, compared with a figure of more than 70% in advanced European economies. As a result, and I think we know this very well at EBRD, support for reforms has been weakening, and we documented this malaise back in 2013 with the famous transition report. It was titled Stuck in Transition. And in part, of course, this trend reflects something quite simple: reform fatigue. Despite that, though, I think the bigger picture is that many of our countries of operation have been transformed over the last 25 years. If you look at emerging Europe and Central Asia, income per head measured at purchasing power parity was around a quarter of that of the G7 economies back in the early 1990s. Today, that figure is in the region of 45%. Now, the EBRD focus today must be on remedying that reform fatigue to ensure that the next 25 years bring about the further changes that are required. And I strongly believe that we're more than capable of doing just that. We've shown time and again how adept the EBRD is at responding to new challenges over and over again. In fact, as our countries have changed, so has this bank. Since 1991, our reach has expanded from Central and Eastern Europe to stretch across 3 continents, from Mongolia in Central Asia to Morocco on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, from Estonia on the Baltic to Egypt on the Mediterranean, to economies that were centrally planned and economies that never were, showing how our business model, focused on private sector development, has wide application. Geography, though, isn't the only way we've adapted over the years. The scope of what we deliver, too, has expanded. We've scaled up investment to mitigate the effects of climate change, targeting energy efficiency and renewable energy. We've financed environmentally and commercially viable municipal services. And we played a crucial role in heading off the collapse of our region's banking sectors through the Vienna Initiative after the 2008 crisis. So we've proved ourselves capable of responding quickly to changing circumstances, perhaps most recently as we did after the events in the Arab world in 2011. In just over 3 years, from a standing start, we've invested more than 3.5 billion euros in almost 100 projects in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia. And more recently, we've been asked by our shareholders to work temporarily in Greece and Cyprus to assist in their recovery. So we've honed our skills, we've enhanced our reputation for 25 years, and today we are transforming that accumulated experience into a program for the future, a program for a world that's growing ever more complex. As we start on the next chapter of the EBRD's history, our aim must be to help re-energize transition, and that means having even more impact in our countries of operations. Between now and 2020, we're going to be focusing on 3 themes in our countries of operations, as agreed with our shareholders. First of all, building economic resilience and sound institutions. Second, helping them to integrate better into regional and global economies. And third, enabling them to combat common global challenges such as climate change. If we're going to succeed in this endeavor, we're going to need to ensure that investment and policy advice go hand in hand. Now, each of our projects does deliver change, but just as important will be the systemic transformation that can only be secured through clusters of projects and broader engagement with governments on issues where we can add value, such as sector reforms and investment climate. For example, our new green economy transition approach is going to deliver much more climate financing, targeting 40% of EBRD investment each year by 2020, coupled along with policy dialogue. We're also going to be building a new gender equality approach into our projects. Our goal, quite simply, is to boost reforms and our country's competitiveness, reinvigorating transition and growth. And to do that, we're going to have to lead by example. Our own institution, of course, is going to have to retain its youthful vigor. We should continue to be brimming with the energy of a 25-year-old. We shouldn't wallow in nostalgia, and we shouldn't amble down the road which leads to comfortable middle age. That would make our initiative to ensure that we're much more efficient internally so that we can be much more effective externally. That's what we're all about here at the EBRD. So as we celebrate our birthday this week, we can take great pride in our achievements. But this isn't an institution that's ever going to rest on its laurels. Even if we were actually tempted to do so, the long list of challenges confronting our regions should quickly cure us of any complacency. Indeed, I think sometimes that list can sound rather overwhelming. Sluggish, non-existent growth in some places, shortfalls in investment, unemployment, especially of the young, migration from conflict zones on an epic scale now, tackling corruption, improving the investment climate, threat of climate change, all are evident in our region. But we're not daunted by the scale of those challenges. That's the great thing about this institution. In fact, we relish challenge. We have the skills, the creativity, the experience, always to help find a way through for our countries of operation. So friends, I believe our first 25 years have clearly been very eventful, but the next 25 promise to be just as exciting and rewarding. Thank you very much.
Suma, thank you very much indeed. Well, as I said at the beginning, as Suma referred to in his speech, now it's time to go on to the Life in Transition survey. It is a very good snapshot that we've been taking at regular intervals, along with the World Bank, of how people, how the citizens of our regions are being affected by transition, how they view what's happening around them. And I'd like to call on Ralph de Haas now, the Director of Research in the Chief Economist's Office, to give us a snapshot of some of the latest results, which, as I said, really are, at the moment, just a little bit beyond raw data, I think, Ralph.
That's right, exactly. Okay, so I was asked to give you some very preliminary results based on the latest survey round, which is actually literally in the field at the moment. So there's data coming in, and it's very difficult to distill the main messages at this point in time. So I brought two things, basically, a slideshow with loads of interesting facts, hopefully, and a timer. So I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, and I'll see how much interesting stuff I can put into this 10 minutes. Before I start, let me show you what a typical macroeconomist would probably show you when talking about 25 years of transition. It would be something like this graph. So it shows you most of our countries of operation, and most of these are green. And that means that in these countries, we see over the past 25 years, so from 1989 until now, an increase both in income and an increase in consumption. So we see people have become richer, they are earning more, and they're able to consume more. And this is pretty much the case for all of the countries in which we have been operating, with a couple of exceptions, which are the ones that I'm showing you here in red and in yellow, which are all countries that for some reason, for some period, have been affected by either a civil war or some other kind of conflict. But in the countries where that didn't happen, transition process has resulted in more income and more consumption. Now, that's interesting from a macro perspective, but as a project-driven bank, we really want to know much more and in much more detail how the transition process is affecting our region. And for that, the most effective way of doing that is simply talking to people in a very structured way and eliciting information and asking them how they think about their lives and how they think about politics and about the economic system. This is what we do in the Life in Transition survey. As we mentioned before, we've done that in 2006, we've done it in 2010, so that's nice, before the crisis, after the crisis, and we're doing this again in 2016. We're interviewing about 50,000 people, and they are based in all of these towns and cities and villages that I'm showing you here, the red dots. We're also doing this in Italy and Germany to get a nice comparison group, okay? So this is where we've talked to people, and these interviews take about 1.5 to 2 hours, so we can really extract a lot of information. Now, one of the things that become very clear when you look at the data, in particular the data that we collected right after the global financial crisis, is that households in the East, in our region, have been hit very, very hard by the global financial crisis. And as you can see, we have a number of comparison countries here, so the UK, France, and Germany that were part of earlier rounds as well. You see the colors are much more pink, not as red as the ones in the East, and that is showing you that the impact on households was much less than what we see in the East. So in the East, more than 3/4 of all people told us that they have either lost a job, they've lost access to remittances, or they had to take a very significant cut in their wages. And this is much less happening in the West. In the West also, safety nets were much better developed, so people that were affected by the crisis were in real terms often much less affected. And you can see that Lithuania, Serbia, and Hungary were among the countries where the crisis had a particularly strong impact. Now, in the latest round, so the one that is currently in the field, we also added Greece. And as you can see here, Greece, again, is one of the countries that currently is being very, very heavily affected by the crisis of the last couple of years. And again, about 3 out of 4 Greeks told us that they either lost a job, lost access to remittances, or had to take a very significant cut in their wages. This is interesting to know. It's also very important to know because it has a big impact on how people think about democracy, how they think about political systems, how they think about reforms. And this is what I'm showing you here in this graph. So what we basically try to understand is to what extent people that have been very affected by the crisis change their perceptions about reforms, the economic system, and the political system. What we find is that by and large, in those countries that were hit hard by the crisis, so these are the ones here on the left in the bottom, so in particular countries like Estonia and Latvia in the Baltics, those countries saw very sharp recessions and at the same time saw a very sharp drop in support for a democracy and support for market-driven economic systems. If this is a temporary drop, that can be accommodated. If this is a longer-term process, of course, that can have very important consequences for economic growth. And so I'm showing you this for a market economy. This is preferences for democracy. And you can see a very similar relationship. Countries that were hit very hard see a very sharp drop in support for markets and support for democracy. Now, the good news is that these things tend to recover. And this is one of the things that we find in the survey that's currently in the field. So we see if we compare Southeastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltics, SEE and CEB, we look at the data for 2006, 2010, and 2016, we see that in the latest round, there seems to be a bit of a rebound. So people are supporting democracies and reforms and privatization and all of these things more than they tended to do a couple of years after the crisis. So I think that's a positive. Another positive is what we measured in Greece. So we actually see that notwithstanding the fact that in Greece, the impact of the crisis has been very, very strong, very, very negative, support for markets and for a democratic political system seems to be relatively well ingrained. It's gone down most likely, but it's still at a level that's actually higher than what we see in most of the transition region. So that's another positive to take away from this. Now, one of the things that we ask people about is, if you would be, if you could influence the government precisely, if you could tell them what to focus on, what would be the main areas, what are the most urgent areas your government should invest in? And again, we do that in the transition region. We also do it in comparator countries like Italy and Germany. What we found is that there's a lot of commonality, actually. I was quite surprised. So people worry a lot about unemployment. In the East, that's by far the main thing that people tell us, that it's the main thing that people are worried about is reducing unemployment. The other thing that is very common between the East and the West is healthcare. This was a bit surprising to me, but a lot of people that we interviewed really think there's a bigger role for the government to play in healthcare. And then there are differences between the East and the West. I think the most important one is here. If you look at the transition region, you see that corruption really pops up in a lot of countries, one of the main issues that people are worried about and think that the government should pay more attention to. In the West, that's not, or in the comparator countries, that's not the case. What we see, and again, this is based on data for Germany and Italy, is that immigration is a very, not surprisingly perhaps, is the main topic that pops up. In the transition region, this is not hardly mentioned at all. So there are differences, but there are also commonalities. In particular, unemployment and healthcare are topics that people think government should spend much more attention on. Now, there are a lot of things that governments can do in the short term or in the longer term, but we also see that there are very persistent differences across countries and across societies in how people think about the role that men and women, for instance, should have in the economic process. And this can really have a big impact also on how these economies are structured and how what the room for maneuver is for governments to actually intervene and try to reduce unemployment. So again, this is based on some of the data that we collected over the last couple of weeks. And these are answers on the horizontal axis. These are answers to a question where we basically ask people, do you support a traditional family or gender role? So the exact question is whether, to what extent they think that a family where the husband is taking care of earning the money and the woman takes care of raising the kids is the best family situation, the best division of labor in a household. Now, what we see is that there are huge variation across the countries of operation. I was quite surprised. If you look at Germany and Poland, only about 10% of the people think that this is the best way to structure a household. While in countries ranging from Bulgaria and Tajikistan, for instance, it's over 60% of the people that still think that this is the best way to structure a household. So without putting any value judgment on that, I think it's interesting to see that A, there's a lot of variation, Also, when you then start to correlate that with macroeconomic outcomes, you see that you find at least correlations that make sense, in the sense that in countries where there's more support for these traditional roles, there's also much lower female employment in the labor force. So again, if people are worried about unemployment or about employment in general, there is a role for the government, but also these persistent, longer-term effects that we see across countries are very important as well, and important to understand, in particular for an organization like this one that does projects together with the private sector and needs to be able to have access to a wide variety of employees. In the interest of time, my stopwatch is very strict. I'm going to skip this slide here, and I want to end with a piece of good news. It was already mentioned that there is this happiness gap between the West and the East. What we see is that very persistently, people in Western comparator countries tend to be much more satisfied with the lives that they are currently living. They are currently leading. Important difference. And what we see in the East is that the life satisfaction is lower, and the positive news is that it's gradually increasing. So if you, for instance, look at Southeastern Europe, you see that in the 3 rounds from 2006 to 2010 and the latest round in 2016, there is an increase in life satisfaction that's quite significant. Again, what you see in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a temporary drop as a result of the crisis. There has been more than a recovery in the years after that. So what we see is in the last couple of months, people seem to have really on a path where they are much more positive about their lives, and they actually seem to be closing the gap with Western comparator countries. And this is, I think, a positive development. We're currently trying to see to what extent that's holding up in other parts of the region as well. We don't have the data for Russia and for Eastern Europe and the Caucasus yet, but my expectation is that in these parts of the region as well, we see a gradual increase in life satisfaction and happiness in general, which is a very important thing to track as well. So let me leave it at that, and let's continue with the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Ralph, thank you very much indeed. Some very interesting data coming in there. Now let's take a bit of a deeper dive then into that discussion that we've started. I'd like to ask our distinguished panel to come up here and take their seats, starting with the former president of Latvia, Vaira Vaika-Freiberga. Perhaps I could ask you to take a seat just over here. Jordanian Minister of Planning and International Cooperation and EBRD Governor, Imad Fakhori. Simeon Jankov, former chair of the EBRD Board of Governors, former Bulgarian finance minister, distinguished economist. Sergei Guriev, the incoming EBRD chief economist, and Suma as the EBRD president. Suma, if you sit here. Let's move on from where we were on this LITS material, which I think gives us quite an insight into what people are feeling today. And I think it might be useful now just to start with a few opinions on where people think we stood in 1991, because this is about a journey. Transition is a journey. And perhaps I'd like to ask you, former Latvian President Freiberga, if you cast your mind back to 1991, how did Latvia seem to you, and what did you think might be the trajectory of change?
I must first get untangled from
Is that, so that's probably what people in Latvia were saying at the time.
Of modern technology. Well, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here on a happy occasion, because the 25th anniversary is definitely a jubilee, something to be joyful about. But as the chairman pointed out, it is not just that, it's also a moment for evaluation. After all, he who rests on his laurels wears them in the wrong place. And it's better to be crowned with laurels than sitting on them. And the data that we have just seen recently, I think, are part of such an evaluation. And I am delighted to see that, because it evokes all sorts of conclusions, as much as questions about what change means, what progress means, how to evaluate what we have achieved until now, and how to evaluate what we should be doing in the future. The EBRD came in as one of the clear expressions of radical change in practically the half of Europe that had been put on ice ever since the end of the Second World War, and frozen in a sort of time machine that the communist system imposed on it. That's a paradox, as so often these things are, especially linked with ideology. The communist ideology, the revolution of 1917, was all about change, improvement, growth, creating the new Soviet man, creating a new world. If you like, at the beginning of the 20th century, one had this millennial vision of a world revolution that would change mankind. Well, we have had these before, we have them today, and no doubt we will have them tomorrow as well. And here we have to find some sort of balance between hope and despair. If people live in a system like the Soviet system was, for decades on end, there comes a point where they lose hope and they lose faith in their own abilities. The system grinds them down. The system disparages individuality, individual effort, and it disparages the possibility of change other than that dictated and prescribed by an elect group, the Communist Party, who will decide what is good for you. In other words, there's this infantilization of society. You have a parental figure, which is the Communist Party, which will decide and tell you children how you should behave and what you should do. And if you obey Papa and Mama, then things will go well. And if you disobey, the punishment should be, in fact, quite severe. And Stalin, with his repressive system, actually was supported by large parts, especially of the Russian population, who felt that the price was worth the outcome. That, for instance, the Stalinian propaganda was actually delighted by the Second World War because it reinforced what the purges of the 1930s had been saying, that communism was under threat, that everybody hated it, which was true enough in many ways, that they wanted to change it, and they had to fight with all their might to cling on to the same thing. Now, when we saw the wall come down in 1989, it was a sort of a riptide of psychological change, where people said, first of all, we have been looking forward to change. We are tired of stagnation. Brezhnev's time was famously one of stagnation, and that's how he is remembered by history. The change that people were looking for was very simple and plain: to have a better quality of life. But how to have this better quality of life? This included the freedom to choose, the freedom to go their own way, and what people didn't always remember, the freedom to choose meant that the consequences could sometimes be what you wished them to be and very happy. But one could make mistakes in one's choices. And that is the part about change that, of course, is distressing. Recent studies have shown that change and the possibility of choice, which are the absolute fundamentals of freedom and the bulwark of democracy, psychologically are causes of stress. And if you think in your lives in situations where you had to decide, when a girl has to decide between this suitor and another, and she kind of likes them both, and she's wondering who will make the best partner for the rest of her life, or vice versa. Even having to buy a new car can be very distressing and very upsetting because you're always worried that maybe your neighbor is going to show up with a splendid thing that will put yours to shame after all that you have hoped to be the shining example on your particular street, and so on and so forth. The changes that the EBRD hoped and helped and in fact helped to effect were extremely fundamental. The democratic choice of having free elections, of having political systems and so on, is one part of recovering our independence. And it has, this one could have, you know, a whole seminar for 3 days and talk about what all that implies. And why disappointment, even when something you dream for decades and sometimes centuries, and when you get it, frankly, it's not quite what you thought it might be. There is an element of potential disappointment there. But the EBRD was focusing on the other aspect of this sort of sea change of conditions, and that was free market as opposed to a controlled system of systematic deficit of products that people wish and desire to have in their daily lives. Consumer products of daily life, conditions of life, decent, clean, proper toilets in the right places and that people have access to. That, believe you me, for anybody who visited the Soviet Union before the change, they would realize how simple and elementary the things that one could long for could be in terms of practical realities. But the money economy in a system of free market economy is one where you have a situation of glut. We have too many things, and you are faced with these choices, and since you're a little kid and decide which candy to buy or which toy to ask from your parents, one is brought up and trained in making choices. In a communist system where choices by definition are very looked at as with suspicion, where the population is infused with a sense of, don't you worry your little head about it, the party will take care of it. It will make decisions, just obey and follow the route that has been traced out for you, which is oppressive, which is upsetting. But in many ways, it's also liberating. It liberates you from the responsibility of choice. And now when you are faced with choice, you are also faced with the consequences of choice, which, as I indicated, are not necessarily what you had dreamed because you don't have the information about which will be better. And one of the fundamental stumbling blocks that I remember us who had been brought up in exile by our parents who fled the communist system, lived in democratic and free countries for most of our lives. When we started going back to our native countries, what we discovered is that people didn't have the same conception of economy, period, as people in the West. Why? Because the value of goods and services, the concept of value, was completely different. And the role that money played in a system that a market is essentially a system of supply and of exchange was completely different. And again, I think that if one were to reduce it to two contrasting elements, is one, if you have a system of glut, as in the West, then you're being assaulted by what we clamor is excessive materialism. We are assailed by advertising that tells you drink this rather than that. The must bag for women this season is this rather than that, and women worry about it a great deal. Do I have the must bag of this season or not? And so on and so forth. And advertising tries to induce in a way anxiety in you about having the right thing. In a deficit economy in an economy of lack such as the communist system. The whole point is, do I have it at all or not at all? And since everything is in limited supply, what is introduced is what was known in the Soviet Union as glut. If the butcher is the one who distributes the best cuts of meat, or meat period, you know, when there's little of it, when you have one sort of sausage available, if you're lucky and you go there early enough and you stand long enough in line, the butcher becomes a very important person whose friendship and attitude towards you becomes very precious. So if you're a baker, on the other hand, and the butcher comes to you and says, my wife has a birthday and I'd like to have a very nice cake for her. Well, at that time, the baker becomes the important person, because he might say, well, we're all short of eggs and of cream, and sorry, I really, you know, I can't help you out unless my paw gets greased a little bit, unless the next time I visit you, you'll give me a better cut of meat, I'll give you a better cake or a cake at all for your wife, and so on it goes. And this sounds very innocent. You are installing a barter system in a system where monetary system is deficient. However, because supply and demand do not answer to the usual concept of a free market, but what this blood system does is it deeply ingrains a skewed idea of relationships between supply and demand, between a service that you are paid for, as say as a state employee, and your job is to stamp certain things and to do certain approvals, or a system where you realize that by not applying your stamp to a certain document, you become a very important person. And if somebody absolutely needs that stamp in order to renovate their apartment or to buy a new car and so on, well, again, greasing the paw becomes the answer, and corruption is not just born, it flourishes, it becomes the essential. The blood is the twin brother of corruption. And mind you, we all know, you open your special smartphones or television or your newspaper, and you see that we have people hiding illegal gains and not paying taxes on them in the most free and open and democratic of countries. A free market and an uncontrolled or unplanned economy is not the panacea for ensuring that people are going to be open, honest, responsible, civic-minded, warm-hearted, and, well, admirable human beings. They will indeed change as they will do anywhere else. But there are some systems, some social systems, that are just like putting compost on your roses or something, that will make them bloom in a passionate way. And this is what corruption has done in all the countries which either have very bad governance, which have totalitarian governments which restricts people's freedom, or where the psychology of the people in many ways has been harmed by decades of essentially controlled and totalitarian approaches to what should be the free exchange of goods and services, and the free choice that you make with all the consequences that you accept if you are brought up from childhood to mature and to realize that that is part of life. So there's so much to study still. Ladies and gentlemen, those who are researchers among you, I do entreat you to do continue at this sort of work, and do continue to gather data, because it's fascinating to analyze, and there's a great deal that we have to learn if we are to avoid the mistakes of the past and to have a better future.
Okay, President Frey, we will come back to you in just a minute. And we'll certainly pick up on some of those themes that you elucidated there. Obviously, we saw corruption coming up in the Life in Transition survey. Imad Fakhoury, we'll come to you in just a second. Let me just stay in the 1991 world at the moment, just so we understand where we've been in the former communist world. Simeon Jankov, if you look back to 1991, What did you think the economic trajectory might be and the economic hope in the few years ahead of that?
I think at the time we were all more optimistic that in a decade or so there will be tremendous economic as well as political change. Some of that happened in some countries more than others, but there is a tremendous divergence as well, something that your survey picks up on, and I think something that gives EBRD and others a lot of work to do, at least in the next 25 years. I want, in my first remark, however, to stay more on the positive side and mention one set of indicators that we have not yet mentioned. In my mind, perhaps the most tremendous positive change that happened in the last 25 years, that is health. Quality of life, but life itself is much longer in our region now than it was 25 years ago. How much longer? Basically, for the region as a whole, including Central Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Central Europe, every year for the last 25 years, on average, we've added about 2.5 months additional life. So in about 25 years of transition, on average, our region now lives 5 years longer. This is across the region. Some countries have added a bit more, some countries a bit less, but we live a lot longer than we used to live. So much so that some of the leading countries like Estonia, like Slovenia, the Czech Republic, the average life expectancy is the same, actually slightly higher than in Western Europe, countries like France. Mind you, I hope we'll talk about the next 25 years. This is without a tremendous change in the management of the healthcare sector. That still is forthcoming. This is just by eating better food, by having less pollution, by basically having life that doesn't have all of these missing things that President mentioned. And one more important indicator, infant mortality. That indicator across all the indicators in the transition economies has improved tremendously, tenfold in some countries. So if we look back 25 years, there are a lot of things that we still have to do, but at least on some indicators we can go back and say the quality of life has been improved tremendously across the region.
Simeon, thank you. And Sergei, looking at it from Russia. 1991 Russia, if you go to some parts of Russia today, I mean, life is economically completely unrecognizable to those days.
That's correct. And if you ask me what it was 25 years ago, I can also relate to what President Vicky Freiberger was talking about. But generally, it was exactly as Simeon said, a very optimistic mood, end of history as formulated by Francis Fukuyama. And so everybody believed in Article 1 of EBRD, market economy and multi-party democracy. And for people of my generation, EBRD was not actually a very important institution because it was clear by the time we get PhD, EBRD will graduate of itself, will finish its job and disappear and will not employ people at all. And in that sense, unfortunately, we probably were quite over-optimistic. And in the last 25 years, we've learned a lot. And unfortunately, this paradigm of market economy and promotion of democracy worked very differently in different parts of our region. Some countries went ahead quickly, some went ahead slowly, and some countries went in circles. And some countries experienced reversals both in terms of private ownership and in terms of hybrid political regimes, let's put it this way. And in that sense, I'm very happy that the EBRD is doing this Life and Transition Survey, because it is exactly how we may actually see why some countries have reversals, why some people feel excluded, what kind of people support reversals, and how we can actually address these issues, how can we build reforms that are inclusive. So I just want to make one thing, that I shouldn't sound over pessimistic in the sense that we shouldn't believe in Article 1. I think in this region, like everywhere in the world, but specifically in this region, we still see very strong correlation between economic prosperity and inclusive democratic institutions. We see countries which are less democratic and are behind in terms of economic development, corruption, health indicators, And we see countries which went quite ahead in terms of political inclusion, democratic transition. And these are also the countries that have modernized their economies. And in that sense, I think we shouldn't criticize Article 1 too much.
Sergei, for the moment, thank you very much. So that was in the former communist world. Imad Fakhuri, 1991, of course, was very different in your part of the world, in Jordan, in the Middle East. It was dominated, as I remember well, by the first Gulf War, of course, 1991, and the impact on the Jordanian economy of the run-up to that, and all the issues that arose from that. But still, Jordan has made huge progress in the past 25 years, hasn't it?
Thank you, Jonathan. And first, allow me to again commend EBRD on a wonderful 25-year track record and anniversary. And EBRD is clearly more and more now becoming relevant after expanding its mandate to our region, our part of the world. Looking today at the region is important to understand what happened the past 2 decades before that, and then where do we go from there. So the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region today is truly at a historic juncture, unprecedented. I mean, you could even go back to World War I to understand maybe what that juncture looks like. For some parts of the region, unfortunately, there will be more disintegration, violence, chaos. We are seeing a displacement movement of people and refugees of unprecedented scale, probably the biggest since World War II, actually, that the world has seen. And obviously, this started with the Arab Spring in late 2010, early 2011. Prior to that, the region was very much focused on there were very few conflicts. At least they look few compared to what we're seeing now, unfortunately, the ones that you mentioned. And the region as a whole was very much focused on the economic side to a large extent, using the oil benefits and part of the oil benefits spilling over either in remittances and workers migrating from the region into the GCC and so on, pursuing gradually open market economies, not in an ideal situation for many, unfortunately, focusing on the development goals that are the traditional ones, like the MDGs, investing in education, in health, and in these areas. And EBRD would have been relevant then to strengthen possibly, one, the economic reform drive with the institutional and legal setup, but two, probably the governance side, which was not a great track record for the region, which is something EBRD focuses on. And we went into an era of really many countries trying to in a faster approach, open the economy, liberalize, privatize, implement structural reforms, and create some of the necessary legal frameworks. And many of the development indicators started to improve. So if you look at it, a lot of countries in our region had tremendous improvement in development indicators. We actually even had some countries that were the IFI's darling cases that turned out to be a complete fallacy when the Arab Spring hit us. So that was very important to look back and understand that. And where it triggered is really looking at the issues of the citizen participation, the governance, the buy-in, the transparency, the accountability, the social justice, the integrity and fighting corruption issues. Those very much were not carried out in tandem with some of the economic reforms and the benefits that were taken, and hence the cracks started to happen in some of the middle-income countries specifically, and Yemen as a lower-income country, and the Arab Spring basically started. And the question became very relevant, what about the reforms? Because clearly they weren't sufficient and they were not sustainable that were implemented to them. So we are today where we are, it's not easy to explain our region because there's a lot of diversity in it, but it's at a very critical, difficult situation. So where do we go this way in terms of our region? Well, we have to go in parallel tracks and concentric circles. For the countries that are in conflict and are potentially falling into failed states, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Iraq to a less extent, we have to focus politically, diplomacy, and exhaust all efforts to stop the violence and start a stabilization, some sort of stabilization. We see positive signs finally in Libya. We're seeing a potential emergence in Syria, the Vienna and Geneva processes. I don't know to what extent they'll lead to something, and so on. But there are other countries in transition in the region that have done relatively well with the Arab Spring, and in spite of the Arab Spring, these have been what I call the countries in transition, very much countries that are trying to pursue comprehensive reform paths. They have started before and they continue. I mentioned 3 critical examples: 2 constitutional monarchies, Jordan and Morocco, and 1 republic, Tunisia. And to a lesser extent, Egypt has embarked on a recent process. Where it goes, we will hopefully look at that. But clearly, we need to strengthen, support these cases and invest in them. But at the regional level, across the board, we cannot ignore that we have to work, one, on fighting the terrorism and extremism, specifically Daesh and the similar franchises, because that is disruptive to all development, all efforts. We have to not only deal military security, but also very much ideologically, root causes, and think of the long term. Second, we have to look at the humanitarian crisis and the refugee challenge. That is very critical, not only on refugees and displaced inside Syria and outside, but also countries hosting the refugees and the host communities themselves. And as I mentioned, invest significantly in the successful transition models, because they are, as Suma said, these are the hopes that could be a demonstration model for the region to deal with it. And obviously, we are working, and we need to work on the political diplomatic processes, on making sure we stop the deterioration along sectarian and inter-religious lines across the region, focusing on regional cooperation systems, confidence-building measures, and the hotspots, and not ignoring, I repeat, not ignoring, resuming the peace process between Israel and Palestine, because that is a great black hole that has the potential to pull the region into more violence. And if you look then at where EBRD can be relevant, well, our regional agenda needs to focus now more than ever on the governance deficit, on strengthening the political participation and reforms, diversity and inclusiveness, especially building open and inclusive institutions, strengthening the regional cooperation system, women and youth empowerment and participation economically, dealing with the youth bulge. The next 10 years, our region needs to create 100 million jobs. And we have one of the highest unemployment rates, especially for youth across the world. Continue educational reforms and skilling and human resource development. Focus on integrating the region, intra-regional trade. We're the worst region, less than 10%. And we need to really focus on that. And embark on approaches that create win-wins, that breaks this zero-sum mentality, whether political or economic, across the region. We also have to deal with the new norm of lower oil prices, and hence the agenda of economic diversification for the GCC has become now paramount and at the forefront for the reason. But clearly, I would say we have to focus on deepening the reforms, making sure they're sustainable, and not doing it in isolation with institutions and the legal setup for these situations. But do not forget the humanitarian crisis, because if it's left unresolved, it has the potential to create a continued vortex of instability for the entire region. So very much like in 1991, we had a West Europe drive an indirect Marshall Plan to help East Europe and so on. I think the region is in dire need of a global Marshall type of a plan to reconstruct, to deepen the intra-regional integration, as well as integrate our region with Europe and strengthen the regional cooperation system. And this is very much building on the Deauville Partnership that led EBRD to enter some of the countries of our region, but really strengthen that even further, which means that EBRD will be even more relevant and impactful for the countries of our region that want to continue their reforms and be relevant to their own citizens.
Imad Fakhoury, thank you very much. I want to move on now to the Life in Transition survey. And actually, I just want to stay with you for a second, Imad, before I talk to the others. The 5 key things that people identify still, as we saw in that survey, as of great importance and concern to them today in the traditional EBRD region. And we haven't done it yet in the CEMED region, but we are looking at how to extend the Life in Transition survey to that region. Unemployment, healthcare, economy, corruption, crime were the 5 things that came up in the Life in Transition survey as the major concerns. If we were to ask people today in the Middle East about their 5 concerns, do you think they'd be the same?
Yeah, I mean, we do these surveys. So I know of, in Jordan, for example, we do these on the government level, and we've had third-party, international, and so on do that. In the latest I've seen, as of this end of, I think, last year, if I recall, obviously stability and fighting extremism, for obvious reasons, have become the #1 priority for the region, given what we're going through. But the second immediately comes is unemployment and poverty. The third comes the whole issue of government services, healthcare, education, and so on, bridging these gaps and so on. And the fourth is fighting corruption and integrity. So to a large extent, if you look at Europe, where migration has become the #1 when you showed us the presentation. So for us, it's the stability, refugee, and all of that has become #1. But the center points are very much similar, I guess, across the regions. And it's human nature, I guess, at the end.
Well, that's very useful to know. Thank you very much. Suma, we saw the 5 priorities there on people's minds in the LITS region. What does that tell us about how the EBRD needs to engage to try to tackle what are clearly still some very big challenges today?
Well, I think there are 2 things that I think really reach out from that survey. One is about unemployment, particularly in our region, traditional region. I think we should be seriously worried politically, socially, and economically about that. We have a huge underemployment of resources, not just unemployment, underemployment of resources, people who are locked out of the system, of the economic system, whether it's women in certain countries or youth in certain countries, but also underdeveloped regions. I mean, one of the things that I think we find very difficult to get across is you cannot judge some of the more advanced transition countries simply by their capitals. You do have to go to some of the rural areas and you see the range of development challenges there. And I think that's something EBRD does need to focus much more on. So I think with our private sector model, very much trying to bring more of the underemployed resources into the economic marketplace is a big thing. Gender strategy, of course, is going to be helpful in that respect. But I think we need to think also about other aspects of inclusion here, about youth and underdeveloped regions too. Secondly, I think the corruption issue cannot be avoided. I mean, you know, we market our region a lot. And when we market the region, the same things come up from businesses, whether they're Western European businesses or businesses in the Gulf or China, wherever we go, North America, the same thing comes up. It's a question of corruption. And for me, this is about institution building. As Vera said, I think you know, the whole question of how can we help build the right institutions. For EBRD, this is, you know, we must do this on the basis of what we know from our projects and our sector work. So we should be really thinking about the investment climate. How can we help to build the solid foundations to give investors some confidence that if they invest in this country, it's you know, it'll be a sound investment. And so, you know, the investment climate and governance initiative that we launched 3 years back now, I think is very, very important. But we need to focus on some key issues there. Ukraine's a good example of this right now, I think, where I was talking to the new Ukrainian ambassador here in London earlier this afternoon. And there is actually a lot of work and a lot of action going on in Ukraine on corruption. But you wouldn't know it. Actually, it's very badly marketed, I think. No one seems to know what's going on, the things that are being tackled. including through the help of the business ombudsperson we helped Ukraine set up. It's just actually not known. So the perception, corruption perceptions index, if you like, is quite different from actually what is actually happening. We've got to do a better job, I think, with our countries of operations of actually marketing them and helping them grow these institutions. So I think there's a big operational thing, which is about transition for growth, bringing in the underemployed, underutilized resources. And there's a big thing around institutional development based on our knowledge at project level and sector level that we should focus on.
Simeon, I mean, one of the 5 things we saw there was healthcare, and that is a huge gap, isn't it, in these countries?
I mentioned on the positive side how life expectancy has risen, infant mortality has fallen, but I also, I think in my remarks, made the point, without any changes in the management of the healthcare sector. The healthcare sector, even in our most advanced countries, is fairly badly run. I would say socialist style badly, communist style badly run in the majority of countries. And somehow, while investments both by EBRD and others have tremendously gone into the region and changed it, the so-called social sectors, healthcare and education have been to some extent left on the side. I think for the next 25 years, my wish at least, would be that EBRD focuses a lot more on health, on education, on healthcare, the management of it, the private sector side of it, because there can be another tremendous improvement in quality of life in our region. In education, because this is incidentally one of the main reasons why people, young people leave our countries and go west in the search for better educational opportunities. Once they leave, it's difficult to get them back. If we also get our educational system to be at par with West Europe's educational system, I think part of the employment, job generation issues will disappear. So that to me is one of perhaps the main 2 or 3 jobs for the next 25 years. Another one, and actually here I think the 2 parts of EBRD's region have the similar issue, which is integration, connections between the countries within our region. So while there has been a tremendous change towards Western Europe of all of our countries, somehow the economic connections between our countries have become a lot weaker over the last 25 years. And as a result, not just some infrastructure projects, but telecom projects, projects in a number of other sectors are a lot more difficult to do. So this is my second wish for the next 25 years of EBRD, to look at projects that simultaneously affect a number of our countries. And I think EBRD is in a unique opportunity, given your expertise, to do this.
Connectivity is going to be key, isn't it, for economic growth? President Freiberg, you mentioned Blatt. Of course, we saw there in the top 5 concerns corruption. Are you surprised that this has not gone away, that it's so entrenched in economies in the region, that it is there still as a serious economic concern 25 years ago?
I think that there's several aspects to it. In one of my first visits as president to the Davos Economic Forum, we were 3 of us Baltic presidents sitting on a panel like this, and people in the audience said, when are you people in the Baltics going to stop having corruption in your major projects? And I said, ladies and gentlemen, when you, representatives of big Western firms, stop giving bribes to our officials for giving you contracts, it's going to help a lot. So it's a complex phenomenon where I see that the disease is like one of those antibiotic-resistant viruses that our hospitals are beginning to be concerned with. We see it everywhere, in advanced countries, in less advanced, and the higher it goes and the greater the payoffs, the greater the temptation. What is very damaging, however, is corruption that goes and permeates every step of human life. For instance, the civil service. it can be a small, if you like, a small infraction in terms of corruption can have very grave, serious consequences that people don't realize. I remember being at a seminar a few years ago in Moscow about the participation of women in society. And one of the Russian presenters mentioned about corruption as a problem in Russia. And she gave an example. She said, in Russia, you are required to have a technical evaluation of your car and get a certificate for it once a year. We do it too in Latvia still. Actually, a good idea, frankly. And curiously enough, many people feel that this is an imposition on them. It is something that the state is asking of them, that it's a nuisance, and supposing they need new headlights, for instance, they won't be able to use and go to the cottage, to their dacha the next Saturday. And so what happens? They go to a garage, to a friendly garage, which for sometimes a trivial sum, will issue a certificate, your car is in perfect shape, without ever looking at it. And this lady was saying that this is suicidal in many ways on the part of those who engage in it. It's not just harmful to the economy and harmful to society. It puts their own lives in danger and those of their loved ones, never mind the people they might be running over with their car, but they themselves might be doing themselves harm if it happens that their brakes need replacing or a brake fuel replacement. They could kill themselves by saving themselves 10 rubles that the exam would have cost. And so there are these examples. We had in Latvia a great campaign at the beginning of my presidency against traffic violations, where it had been sort of become, everybody took it for granted. You get a traffic violation, you're stopped for speeding, you're given a little paper that says you have to pay a 10 lat fine. So what you do is you give your driver's license along with 5 lats to the policeman. And the policeman puts 5 lats in his pocket. The state loses 5 lats. No, it loses 10 lats, as a matter of fact, from the economy. But the speeding driver actually feels that this is a trivial price to pay for having been caught, and next time he'll just be more watchful and careful. But we had a tremendous and unacceptable high number of traffic accidents and traffic deaths. Partly because we had poor roads, and we still do, but partly because people were speeding on inadequate and roads that are not like the Autobahn in Italy or in the Autostrada or the Autobahn in Germany, where you cannot speed, especially not with a car where you haven't checked the brakes in a while, and so on. So that if people get this awareness of the harm in simple things, you think you're doing yourself a favor, and it's actually hideously counterproductive. I think that children in school, frankly, should start getting lessons about what is rational and what is irrational, what is socially responsible and socially irresponsible, what is just plain stupid, and what is intelligent.
President Frebo, thank you. I wonder whether the speeding car without any brakes was an analogy for the economy at the moment. But let's move on, because we really have very little time. I just want to ask you all for a very swift view, and Sergei, perhaps I'll start with you. If we look ahead 25 years then, as to where we will be then, what would you say?
Well, if we are as optimistic as 25 years ago, we hope that all our countries will graduate and we have no business. But I think actually looking around at the Western countries, we see a lot of challenges that our countries will face. And these challenges represent the challenges related to employment, to jobs, to skills. We see that many jobs in the middle of the skill pyramid in the developed countries are disappearing because of automation and globalization. And this is something that our countries are facing or will face. which means the education system, the skill acquisition system should work differently, should be quicker, more agile, more flexible, because the qualitative change is that 25 years ago, you learn once, you have a job for life, or at least you have an occupation for life. Now you learn once, and your occupation may disappear in 10 years, not just in 25 years. And that is where the challenge is for the OECD countries today, and where the challenge will be for our countries. And here, where the brakes are so important, or the airbags, I should say, the social safety nets that provide you with the time to reskill yourself, to retool yourself, not to allow the crisis to destroy the trust in the social capital, the fabric, the values and attitudes, the support for right institutions, to have immunity against populism. I think this is what is very important. And I think we should think about these issues going back to President Vicky Freiberger's analogies about brakes, and I would say airbags.
Suma, 25 years from now? Brakes, airbags, any other bits of the car you'd like to throw in?
I'm extremely worried about my car now. No, I mean, if the president of EBRD mentions the graduation word, it's immediately taken as a political statement, so I'll stay off that. Thank you very much, Sergei, for thing. I think I remain very optimistic, actually. Before this meeting today, I was very optimistic because of what I saw in the transition report of last year. Chapter 4 for the nerds amongst you, because it really began to show that there was some re-energizing of transition, 30 positive watch indicators, only 8 negative watch indicators. This is at beginnings of signs, and particularly in some areas like public transport, interestingly, transport and infrastructure were areas of great reform. I also have lots of examples of countries which 2 or 3 years ago were not doing anything on reform and suddenly are reforming, whether it's because of the oil price shock, or other reasons. They're talking about diversification, and in some cases really doing some things about it as well, whether it's Serbia, privatization, Kazakhstan on PPP, lots of things going on. So I'm actually, energy subsidy reform in your country, Jordan, and also in Egypt, this is really good. So I'm optimistic about that. And I would have not known until Ralph has just told us, journalists keep asking me about life in transition, and they keep telling me it's awful, isn't it? People are so unhappy. Thank God you've come up with some new data, I say, because at last I can update my speaking points and say, no, actually, it's looking a bit better now. So I'm optimistic that EBRD, whether we still are going as an operation or not, we will have made a major dent in the transition challenges of our region. But the job is urgent. That's the one thing I would say. I am significantly worried by the challenges our region is facing because of the unemployment issues, because of the climate issues. And we have got a job to do, and we've got to get on with it quite quickly, I think, in the next few years to try and turn this round.
Suma, thank you. Simeon, 25 years from now, what do you think will be?
The EBRD would still be around. Most of its, I bet, most of its portfolio would be in social sectors, so a lot more in healthcare, a lot more in education. And my guess is a lot more in smaller municipalities. I know that EBRD already invests a lot, not just at the national, but subnational level, but with better infrastructure, better internet, now people actually don't have to be in the larger cities. They can live and work in smaller municipalities, which then brings the point of how do you develop a smaller place, a smaller municipality, a sub-economy. And that we don't actually know that much yet. We need to yet learn about that.
Can I just add one thing, Jonathan, if I may, just Simeon's earlier challenge, I think is a really good one about integration. Integration is the second of our 3 themes in our strategic and capital framework. He's absolutely right about that. And this is something I really want to see in the next 25 years, however long we keep going. Because EBRD has operated very well at a national level, we haven't done enough cross-border investments. Now, in the Western Balkans, we really have an opportunity now, a set of leaders that want actually to work together and create a sort of bigger economic entity, if you like, and they're also trying to integrate with the EU. It's very helpful. In CEMED, we have a real challenge. I mean, what Imad said about CEMED's complete lack of integration between the economies is everyone should really be aware of. The Agadir, is it the famous Agadir Treaty on this, which actually had some principles of integration? Absolutely nothing has happened. Yeah, absolutely nothing. So this is actually a very big untapped area where I think we must do a lot more, actually.
Well, that goes on to you then, Imad. I mean, 25 years from now, where do you think the region will be?
I prefer to answer that question to focus on Jordan, because the region predicting where we are is not. So I'm very optimistic on the Jordan case, and that's because It's a country that is doing and pursuing comprehensive reforms, political, economic, and social. It's a country that is pragmatic in its politics, meaning we work very hard, given our geopolitical location, to turn challenges into opportunities. Just few examples on that. Think of 2011. Jordan is hit with a perfect storm. We lose all our gas supplies from Egypt, which powers 90% of our power plants. We have hundreds of thousands of people start crossing our border as refugees. And you have the Arab Spring and all what it does in uncertainty and lowering tourism unemployment, and then a massive spillover of conflicts around us, and then to top it off, Daesh, extremism, and everything tied with it. So what do we do? And this is, by the way, when EBRD started working with us, interesting enough, in 2012 onward.
We weren't the harbinger of doing that.
But that's just exactly the point. So they saw a country that was on a good trajectory, but all of a sudden, the sense of urgency that Suma mentioned, no country can survive actually this. And you remember the headlines were, will Jordan survive? And just for those who don't know, this has been our case. Every 10 years there is a crisis like that in our region. So our resilience is built into the Jordanian genetic code because of the things I've mentioned. So we very quickly moved to build a gas terminal to resume importing gas by sea, which started last May doing that. We aggressively moved to diversify our energy resources. We're going up to 15% of our electricity mix becoming renewable by 2020. All projects under implementation, not theoretical, in solar and in wind. We completely did a very strong IMF standby arrangement program because we had to. It's impossible to survive these circumstances on your own, especially when refugees, burden-wise, eat up 20% of your budget, and their needs and those of the host communities are only 1/3 supported by the international community. So for 5 years continuously, you are underfunding everything. We moved aggressively. We were the first in the region to remove fully subsidies on oil products. We started to raise electricity and water tariffs. And we managed the Arab Spring with severe austerity. But given the background I mentioned to you, that's why Jordan continues to be resilient. So going forward, for Jordan, we have tremendous political reforms, 3 new elections coming up in the next 12 months. Our municipal elections, which we started in 1925, we have elected municipal councils. Our 18th parliament is getting elected within the next 1 year. And for the first time, we did decentralization elections, where we're pushing decentralization development-wise to deal with the underdeveloped regions in a more systematic approach, institutional approach, where citizens are participating in that region. And we developed a 10-year Jordan 2025 blueprint that is focused on all the key areas that I look forward and with all of you and EBRD to work on and continue our reforms. But I only mentioned the sense of urgency again. The only big threat to all of the progress we're doing in Jordan is the burden of the regional wars which continue and the refugees. And just to put it in context, we have 1.3 million Syrians in Jordan in a country that's 9.5 million people. This is the equivalent of 100 million migrants moving into the EU. And that's not considering the EU being 12 times at least wealthier per capita income-wise than Jordan. So please understand, for 5 years, what we've been carrying in a burden, that is a very disruptive burden. And even on that, we went to the London conference with a very bold, holistic approach as Jordan, where we're even creating economic opportunities for refugees in a way that expands our economic pie and does not displace our own citizens. But the end message is EBRD and others and the international community need to not forget the sense of urgency and the pressure of a good model country in terms of its reforms and the leadership position we have on fighting terrorism and contributing to peace and security within a very troubled neighborhood and region, not to be taken for granted.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. I'll give the last word to former President Freiberger, and just briefly, if I can ask you, a lot's happened in 25 years. The next 25 years, do you see more equalization between East and West in terms of economic progress? How do you see this trajectory if we would sit here 25 years today?
I must admit I'm a bit disappointed in the degree of equalization that has happened. 25 years is a substantial length of time, and certainly we had been hoping, people in that part of the world, that this equalization would go more quickly. But this is just part of a much broader problem, which is the growing inequality between the top 1% of the population and the rest of it in terms of their income. And if you look at the Gini indicators for just about any country you care to name, over the last 25 years, or the last even 10 years, what we have not seen is a narrowing of the gap. Quite the contrary, the gap has been broadening. This is completely against the whole concept of democracy, of free market, and equal opportunity that democratic countries have been touting. So I think that there are a lot of ingrained, again, psychological attitudes and customs that will, and acquired privileges that will have to be eliminated. For instance, we recently read in the Financial Times that there is a bank where shareholders are actually daring to speak up and to complain about the fact that a bank that has had the worst performance in its existence in the previous year and has lost a substantial amount of money considers it perfectly natural to give the usual 20 million bonus that the contract with its president has foreseen for him. In other words, the worse you perform, the higher your rewards can be if you happen to be in that top 1%. If you happen to be in the bottom part of the other 99%, then things are not quite the same. That sort of equalization, I think, has a long way to go. And another thing I would add is that since we are in a bank here, and the bank was my first job that I had to take at the age of 16 when I went as an immigrant to Canada and was put in a teller's cage, and I really felt like I'd been, a tiger put in this metal cage with bars and taken out of school. But at that time, the bars symbolized the security. If you deposited your money in the bank, you could count on it still being there tomorrow. This is no longer the case. And it's a fundamental concept that took several centuries since the Lombards, against both the injunctions of the Bible and the church attitude towards usury. The Lombards started to do banking as a profession. Banking has increased in popularity, in prestige, in the confidence it enjoyed. If you read 19th century literature, I mean, the banker is the ultimate in the upright citizen whom everybody looks up to. And yes, those tellers' cages in banks were the symbol of the safes and of the locks. And Westerns, half the early Westerns that you see are about the symbol of a society not quite being a lawful society, but a lawless society, is the bank robbers who would attack this holy of holies of the capitalist system. But the banks have a long way to go and financiers, I think, to recover the confidence of the public. And because it goes hand in hand with a loss of confidence in political leaders and the loss of leadership in the world, both at the United Nations, in regional organizations, in countries, in parties. We see an increasing loss of confidence which I think is not unrelated to the loss of confidence in bankers. So that between the bankers and the politicians, I think there really is a job to be done in terms of regaining the confidence of the public.
Thank you very much. We will do our best at the EBRD. I'd like to thank our distinguished panel very much indeed for their thoughts this afternoon. We obviously could have explored this for hours and hours. We're not going to. You'll be glad to hear. I'd like to thank you for listening. And now we've got the chance to continue in perhaps a more informal way, to remember our 25 years, to discuss some of the issues more informally outside where we have a reception for you. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.